Since its inception in 1987, the Holocaust Memorial Week program at Oregon State University has included a major talk by an authority in the field of Holocaust studies. We've been fortunate to attract over the years a number of scholars whose work has really been on the cutting edge, whose work has made a demonstrable difference in how this broad period is understood. This year's speaker, Marion Kaplan, is a professor of history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and at Queens College of the City University of New York. Dr. Kaplan received her PhD from Columbia University in 1977. She has distinguished herself by her work in a field that is rapidly and thankfully growing, the study of the particular impact of the Nazi period and the Holocaust period on women. And indeed, as some of you might know, the Holocaust was in some ways pointed particularly at women, and women suffered particularly from the persecution of the Nazis, and in the Holocaust itself were particular targets. Professor Kaplan's work also recalls another theme that we should, I think, be thinking about at this time of the year. Horrific though the numbers would be by themselves, the Holocaust cost more than 6 million men, women, and children. Really, what was lost then was a world, and a world that was vibrant, a world that was highly diverse, that included Jewish communities all across Europe, but particularly in Central Europe, communities, some of which were characterized by a very orthodox and very traditional lifestyle and mindset. Others, including much of the German Jewish community, one that was quite assimilated, regarded itself as very national and nationalistic in its orientation. All of this was lost. And Professor Kaplan has written brilliantly of this world, notably in Germany, focusing on German Jewish women and on the household, on this world that was lost. And that's what she's going to address in her talk tonight. Her talk entitled, Trying to Weather the Storm, Jewish Women's Responses to Daily Life in Nazi Germany. And with this, I'm proud to present Professor Marion Kaplan.
Thank you very much, Professor Kopperman. When the Nazis came to power, Jews faced a threat to their economic livelihoods and political and social relationships. By the late 1930s, more and more were fleeing. Those left behind struggled simply to survive through ghettos, forced labor, hiding, resistance, and deportation. How did Jewish families, women and children, survive the daily and mounting indignities and abuses of life in Nazi Germany? What were the complex interactions between the everyday lives of Jewish women and families and the German racial community? Although the history of Nazi Germany's annihilation of its Jewish population has been written and rewritten over the past 5 decades, the focus has been on the perpetrators, on Nazi policy toward the Jews, and to a lesser extent on Jewish organizational responses. Other than individual memoirs, there is no history which shows us how Jews at the grassroots coped with deteriorating and then unprecedented circumstances. Since women were at the center of Jewish family culture, holding it together and attempting to keep many of the insidious effects of Nazism at bay, their story offers a more intimate history of the Jewish victims of Nazi genocide than has previously been discussed. Exploring the increasing horror through the eyes of German Jewish women and families, I discovered fascinating stories which demanded retelling as social history and which bring home the eradication of Germany's Jewish minority. In examining what I call the little picture, the daily lives of Jewish women and children, I hope to cast new light on the big picture. By using women's perspectives, I hope to expose the gradual and yet dramatic process of exclusion and genocide in its most basic and quotidian aspect, in the home and family. Now, before I get into things, I just want to give a brief overview of the Jewish community in Germany for those who just want an introduction. In 1933, about 525,000 people were registered as Jews in Germany, or under 1% of the population. Jews were an urban group with over 70% who living in large cities, and a third actually lived in Berlin. Like every minority, the Jewish minority had a career profile that differed significantly from that of the general population. Historically prohibited from a variety of economic endeavors, almost 62% of Jews compared to 18% of non-Jews worked in business and commerce. They were underrepresented in agricultural careers, where less than 2% of Jews, but about 29% of other Germans were employed. The employment of Jewish women had gradually increased from 18% in 1907 to 27% by 1933, but it was still less than that of non-Jewish women, which was about 34%. Of those who worked, over one-third were salaried employees, and about one-fifth were assistants in family enterprises. Most Jews were middle class, although the inflation of the early 1920s and the Great Depression had definitely set them back. In addition, almost 1 in 5 Jews came from Eastern Europe. Most of them, and they were called Ostjuden, eked out humble existences as industrial workers, minor artisans, or peddlers. So we're talking about a society in which about 80% are middle class, lower middle class, upper middle class, and about 20% are working class. In comparison with non-Jewish women, Jewish women generally had smaller families and more education. They were less likely to work outside the home and more likely to have some household help. Although married Jewish women devoted themselves to their families, parents expected their daughters to study for a career. Many, 7 times as many as Christian women, went to the university. Thus, Jewish women were a diverse group, from respectable middle-class housewives to working girls and outrageous new women who lived independent lives in the exciting and disturbing cities of Weimar, Germany. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what started to happen in 1933 in terms of public privation, the public issues that they were facing. In the early years of the Nazi onslaught, it was in the dozens of daily tasks that ground one's life that most Jews, particularly women, suffered and assessed their situation. Daily life consisted not only of the commonplace and ordinary, activities which continued at least until November 1938, but increasingly of the unexpected and startling. Gradually, it became enveloped by lawlessness, ostracism, and a loss of all rights. As Jews went about their normal, I put that in quotes, that is their daily lives, trying to make a living, maintain their previously middle-class economic and cultural standards, nurture their families, and achieve at school, they became increasingly, unrelentingly aware of the steady growth of hostility and danger around them, as their homes, food purchases, friendships, and employment were called into question. Early on, despite the often apparent ordinariness with which Jews continued their daily existence, their internal equilibrium was seriously shattered. Vigilant in public, Jews no longer felt safe even in their homes. They feared house searches and the possibility of the secret police or Gestapo finding or planting incriminating evidence against them. Thus, while the Nazis burned books in public, and I'm sure you've all seen films of that, many Jews burned portions of their libraries and their papers in private. Moreover, Jews could no longer take their homes for granted. They found that their rental contracts were no longer secure and had to face the arbitrary decisions of their landlords long before they officially lost their protection as tenants in 1939. Food purchases were also limited, either by decree or by the hostility of shopkeepers. Women who had frequented certain shops for years found they were no longer welcome. For Orthodox families, the early prohibition against kosher butchering in April of 1933 caused great hardship. As troublesome as renting or shopping had become, the most important indicator of how the Nazi takeover affected Jewish daily life was the daily interactions that Jews had with non-Jewish strangers, neighbors, classmates, and friends. A general coarsening of attitudes toward Jews in public by absolute strangers became more more and more unmistakable as early as 1933. This was part of a more widespread lack of sympathy toward other purported enemies, such as communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, or oppositional social democrats. In fact, when studying Jews in Germany, what I also find very interesting is to see how Germans, average Germans, treated each other, how badly they treated each other. It was characteristic of the everyday interactions of many Germans toward each other to become snippy, to become angry, to become suspicious, or to become accusatory. Well before Jews were forced to wear a yellow star, strangers became instant experts in who looked Jewish, pronouncing their competence loudly and enlightening others in public places. And of course, very often they were wrong, I should add. Also, some Germans literally used their noses to identify Jews. The streetcar seemed to be the location of bad temper and ill will, where Germans, concluding that they recognized a Jewish person in the wagon, would exclaim, "It smells like Jews here." The government intended to completely isolate Jews and largely succeeded in its endeavor. Additionally, the Nazis could count on grassroots enthusiasm. Well before the Nazis prohibited friendly contacts to Jews, gossip and denunciation discouraged such associations. Based on Gestapo files, Robert Galately has observed, quote, an extraordinary degree and variety of accommodation to the regime's doctrines on race. Friendships and business relationships going back many years were broken off. What's interesting to me here is not only the fear of terror, but the incredibly zealous auto-surveillance by the Germans themselves. Thus, companionship with non-Jews became the rare exception. While Jews did experience exceptional cases of friendship and loyalty, ordinarily they met with responses that spanned the spectrum from hostility to avoidance. In general, their former friends, customers, schoolmates, and clients began to avoid them. Along with social dislocation, unemployment began to plague the Jewish community. The alleged laws of April 1933 forced the dismissal or early retirement of Jewish doctors, lawyers, judges, and civil servants. Among the losers in the free professions, Jewish women played a disproportionate role. Whereas some Jewish men could claim exceptional status for war service or employment before 1914, Jewish women could not. The result in the medical field was that the vast majority of Jewish women doctors lost their health insurance affiliation, compared to about 40% of Jewish males. With the disappearance of many Jewish firms due to boycotts, joblessness among Jewish employees became rampant. Even as the German economy improved, going from an unemployment high of 6 million in January 1933 to 2.5 million in January 1936, Jews took no part in the recovery, their unemployment statistics climbing, emigration notwithstanding. Since over half of employed Jewish women worked in business and commerce, they lost their jobs as family businesses shut down. Jewish sources estimated that 3/4 of Jewish women in business and trade were affected by the discriminatory laws and the early anti-Jewish boycotts. By April 1938, over 60% of all Jewish businesses no longer existed, and Jewish social workers were overwhelmed with new cases of hardship. Women's economic future, not just their present, looked bleak. The exclusion of Jews from German universities, vocational schools, and institutions of higher learning restricted employment possibilities. In addition, Jewish job training programs were more limited for girls than for boys. The choices available to girls, if one excluded housework, consisted of sewing-related jobs such as knitting or tailoring. Boys could consider many more options, including becoming painters, billboard designers, upholsterers, shoemakers, dyers, tailors, or skilled industrial workers. To make matters worse, it seemed that parents preferred to keep girls home, either to shelter them from unpleasant work or to help out around their own homes. Such family strategies notwithstanding, Jewish community welfare organizations may have shared the blame regarding the number of girls in training programs, since they often gave preferential treatment to boys seeking career training. In 1936, the proportion of girls in training programs was only 25%. In the first 6 months of 1937, Jewish organizations reported that far more boys than girls were receiving subsidies as well for their career training or retraining. But even if one did retrain successfully, chances were that there would be no jobs at the other end. Jewish businesses in which one might apprentice were closing down. Also, increasingly, Nazi decrees eliminated career choices. Limited options on the job market notwithstanding, many Jewish women, most of whom had never worked outside the home, suddenly needed employment. One news article praised women's flexibility and versatility, commenting that, quote, "We find relatively few families in which the wife does not work in some way to earn a living," and noting that women were also sole supports in many families. Memoirs and statistics indicate that women fervently sought opportunities to train and retrain for jobs. There were women who trained for several possible jobs at once, assuming they needed to be versatile should they be forced to emigrate. One woman studied English and took lessons in sewing furs, making chocolate, and doing industrial ironing. A mother and her daughter took courses in Spanish, English, baking, and fine cookery. The reason they took Spanish and English is they didn't know if they'd wind up in Spain or they'd wind up in England. So people were always taking different languages. In fact, there was a joke in the Jewish community, which was, which language are you taking? Oh, naturally, the wrong one, meaning that as soon as they got through one language, the borders closed and then they had to take another language. Terrible joke, but I mean, they thought it was a joke. A mother and her daughter took courses in Spanish, English, baking, and fine cookery. Then they asked their laundress to accept them as her apprentice. This was not only a new role for them, but a reversal of their previous class positions as well. Whereas most women understood their behavior within the context of an emergency, some may have even used these dire circumstances to fulfill certain ambitions that might have languished in better times. One woman began training as a psychotherapist. For this, she had to leave her husband and children for an entire year in order to study at Jung's Institute in Zurich. In normal times, she would have remained a doctor's wife. According to observers, women appeared more accommodating and adaptable and had fewer inhibitions than men, were amenable to changing their lives to fit the times, and were willing to enter retraining programs at older ages than men. Leaders of the Berlin community noted that retraining women also was less costly and took less time because they already had more skills which related to their new work, such as sewing or housekeeping, and which gave them a head start in retraining for jobs as seamstress, milliner, or in various forms of domestic work. Moreover, jobs were available for young women. Even though many had lost jobs in commercial fields, younger women could find comparable jobs in the expanding Jewish social service sector. And after the Nuremberg laws, which forbade Jews from hiring female Aryan household help under the age of 45, the same women found work in Jewish households. Private responses are another thing that I'm looking at, not just the public issues, but the private issues. In the face of progressively worsening living conditions, it was women who were supposed to make things work in the family. Jewish housewives tried to prepare less expensive meals, to make home and clothing repairs themselves, and to make do with less help around the house. The Nuremberg laws, which not only defined who was a Jew and rescinded Jewish citizenship, but also forbade the employment of Aryan household help, as I just mentioned, left Jewish women to their own devices in running a household with greater problems, in shopping for food in increasingly hostile stores, and in doing these tasks with ever-shrinking resources. Women's organizations urged women to preserve the moral strength to survive and looked to biblical heroines for role models. Increasingly, it became apparent that biblical role models would not suffice in providing Jewish women with either the courage or the help they needed. Jewish newspapers began to deal more openly and probably more honestly with the issues plaguing families, particularly women. Cooking seemed to take a preeminent role among issues causing stress because of tight budgets, limited household help, and the difficulties of acquiring kosher meat for many. To lighten women's loads, newspapers ceaselessly urged housewives to organize, streamline, and cut back on their tasks. Husbands were expected to pitch in only minimally. More commonly, husbands were requested to limit their expectations and to restrain their criticisms. And I quote, "A husband must also adapt. We demand no sacrifices from husbands, only some consideration." Although economic conditions had changed profoundly, with women carrying their full share of the economic burden, gender privilege within the family persisted, barely modulated. Whereas writers urged a complete re-evaluation of the class privilege formerly permitted the leisured middle-class girl in light of her mother's increasing burdens, they continued to allow husbands their leisure at home. Why this was so is not so difficult to explain, and I quote, "We must be clear that work for married women is only and may only be an expedient in an emergency. By proclaiming the crisis nature of women's new position, Jews, both male and female, could hope for better times and ignore the even more unsettling issue of male-female roles in the midst of turmoil. Women frequently took responsibility, not only for the physical double burden, but also for the psychological work necessary to raise the spirits of their children and husbands and to tide the family over until better times. And this is still a period between 33 and 36, 37, when people are hoping for better times. For example, as families moved into smaller apartments or as others took in boarders in order to make ends meet, tighter living quarters caused all sorts of strains. Further, tensions regarding whether or not to emigrate could surface. Also, women had to deal with children who were frustrated at school, where their academic and social efforts were thwarted by Nazi teachers and hostile classmates. These children needed understanding and encouragement or a change of school, and a good number went to Jewish schools. While husbands, facing mistreatment to which they were not accustomed, also needed a comforting haven. In some, it meant that women were to try to be cheerful when gloom was all about. As late as February 1938, one woman entitled an article she wrote in a newspaper, "Why So Solemn?" reminding Jewish women that they had traditionally been the ones to light the candles. She urged them once again to brighten their homes with cheer. Even when women could no longer light candles of joy, they often managed a kind of denial about their immediate hardships, while, as will be seen, nevertheless pushing for emigration. That is, they tried to distract themselves and their families from the gloom around them. Although in some cases this may have kept the family from realizing the danger sooner, some denial was necessary in order to preserve their own and their families' stability. They did this through what psychologists called adoptions of temporary frames of security, for example, in practical efforts. Some women, in fact, may have even taken solace from their additional housework burdens, finding safety in the routines that they had established. This particular form of escapism usually lasted longer for women than the male version, escape by submerging into occupational activities, did for men, because men lost their jobs. Women at least still had the housework to do. Other women joined voluntary organizations in an effort to both help the community and take their minds off the real issues plaguing them. In fact, many seem very conscious in retrospect that they were doing this. In one memoir, Alice Beerwald wrote that she had distracted herself from her own needs by setting up a Zionist youth emigration program in Danzig. She was so busy with it that, quote, "I forgot to dismantle my own life." Now, within the family, there were also very interesting role reversals that took place, where women took on what we would have thought of in the past as male roles. And I'm going to talk about that. Their normal middle-class lives and expectations overturned, Jewish families embarked on new paths and embraced new strategies that would in all likelihood never have happened in ordinary times. For women, this meant new role as partner, as breadwinner, as family protector, and as defender of the business or the practice, roles that were often strange to them. Increasingly, women found themselves representing or defending their men, either husbands, fathers, or brothers. Many tales have been recorded of women who have saved family members from the arbitrary demands of the state or from the secret police. In these cases, it was always assumed that the Nazis would not break gender norms. They might arrest or torture Jewish men, but would not harm women. Thus, women regularly mediated between the state and the family. They were able to manipulate the system slightly and consequently took on a more assertive role in the public sphere than ever before. In one small town, a Jewish family decided to send 2 of its women to the city hall in order to ask that part of their house not be used as a meeting place for the Nazi party. Other women interceded for family members with German emigration or finance officials. In some cases, they not only broke gender barriers, but also normal standards of legality. Many memoirs report that Nazi officials had to be bribed, and that despite their original shock at such requirements, women quickly handed them the necessary goods or money. Women took on more demanding tasks than simple representation or even bribery. Some actually took responsibility for the entire family's safety, a reversal of previous roles with their husbands. One woman traveled to Palestine to assess the situation there. Her husband, who could not leave his practice, simply told her that if you decide you would like to live in Palestine, I'll live there too. Her husband, older and more educated than she, who in other circumstances had been the decision maker, agreed to her choice, Greece. Another woman went to England to negotiate her family's emigration with British officials and medical colleagues. Her daughter wrote, quote, "It was thanks to her pertinacity and determination that we were able to leave Germany as soon as we did. And it was always to be a great source of pride to her that it was she who obtained the permit allowing us to come to England." Women often found themselves in dramatic situations in which their bravery benefited from luck. 20-year-old Ruth Abraham urged her parents to move to Berlin to escape the hostility of their small town, and then regularly accompanied her father to Gestapo headquarters for his weekly interrogation. When her uncle was arrested, she hurried from jail to jail until she found his location. Then she appealed to a judge who seemed to have been attracted to her. He requested that she come to his home in the evening where he would give her a release form. Knowing that she was taking the risk of a sexual demand or worse, she entered his home but was treated politely. He signed the release. She commented, and I quote, "I must add that I look absolutely Aryan, that I have blonde hair and blue eyes, and I am tall." These traits would later save her life in hiding, but for the moment she was able to gain the interest or sympathy of men who did not want to believe that she was Jewish. Abraham's success notwithstanding, traditional sexual gender conventions could be quite menacing. Despite Nazi propaganda against what they called racial pollution, Jewish women recorded incidents which they considered dangerous, in which Aryans or even Nazis made advances toward them. I should add, every time I use the word Aryan, I have quotes around it because it's so silly, but I don't want to move my fingers like this each time. Women's new roles and the role reversals just described may have increased stress in some cases, but in general, both women and men appreciated the importance of the new behaviors. Women forced themselves to behave in unwomanly ways, some putting up a strong front when men lost it. One woman described her endeavor to retain her composure for the sake of her children as her husband sank into deeper and deeper depression, claiming he should no longer eat or live if he could not support his family. It's striking that in the testimonies of both men and women, women's calm, dry-eyed state in the midst of turmoil and disaster is emphasized. Whether this desire to appear calm was a result of middle-class upbringing in the face of what they perceived as the Nazi rabble, or an attempt by Jews to retain their dignity or their family's equilibrium in the face of persecution, or a proclamation of female stalwartness to counter the stereotype of female frailty, it is noted more by women than by men. Probably men took this kind of behavior for granted for themselves, whereas women, previously allowed and encouraged to be the more emotional sex, were particularly conscious of their efforts at self-control. Now I want to talk about the need to emigrate and the push that, that some families experienced from their wives and their mothers to emigrate. In general, it was women who urged emigration on spouses who, for many reasons, thought they could remain in Germany. A gender analysis of the desire to emigrate highlights women's different expectations, priorities, and perceptions. Women whose identity was more family-oriented struggled to preserve what was central to them by fleeing with it, while men had businesses, clients, patients, political involvements, and often their World War I service, which tied them more tightly to Germany. Moreover, although less integrated than men into the work world, women were more integrated into their neighborhoods and their communities. Raised to be sensitive to interpersonal behavior and social situations, women's social antennae were more finely tuned than their husbands. Women registered the increasing hostility of their immediate surroundings, unmitigated by a promising business prospect, a loyal employee or patient, or a kind customer. Women's constant contacts with their own and other people's children and the community probably alerted them to the warning signals that come through interpersonal relations, and they took these very seriously. Men mediated their experiences through newspapers and broadcasts. Politics may have remained more abstract to them, whereas women's narrower picture, their neighbors, direct everyday contacts, the minutiae and significance of ordinary details, brought politics home. But convincing husbands that their wives' pictures were more accurate often led to husbands pulling rank, insisting that they understood politics better than their wives and accusing wives of being too emotional or too hysterical. Summing up, Peter Wyden, the author of the book Stella, recalled the debates within his own and other Berlin Jewish families. And I'm quoting, "It was not a bit unusual in these go or no-go family dilemmas for the women to display more energy and enterprise than the men. Almost no woman had a business, a law office, or a medical practice to lose. They were less status conscious, less money-oriented than the men. They seemed to be less rigid, less cautious, more confident of their ability to flourish on new turf." That men and women often assessed the dangers differently reflected their different contacts and frames of reference. But in contrast to the role reversals I mentioned earlier, decisions to emigrate seem to have been made by husbands, or later by circumstances. After the November pogrom, there were wives who broke all family conventions by taking over the decision-making, when it was unequivocally clear to them that their husband's reluctance to leave Germany would result in even worse horrors. One woman by the name of Elsa Gerstel recalled that although her husband had been arrested on November 9th, he did not have to go to a camp and still had no intention of leaving Germany. She got the affidavit, and they left. The November pogrom revealed the radicalization of Nazi persecution. In contrast to the Crystal Night image that we understand to signify the broken glass of Jewish stores, homes, and synagogues, Jewish women's memoirs often focus on flying feathers. Feathers covering the internal space of the home, hallway, and front yard or courtyard. Similar to pogroms in Russia at the turn of the century, the marauders tore up goose feather blankets and pillows, shaking them into the rooms, out the windows, and down the stairs. Not only were Jews thus bereft of their bedding, and with that the kind of physical and psychological security and comfort that this represented and that they had once known, but these items could not be easily replaced, in part because of their expense, and also because in the looming war economy, linens were severely limited. It is this image of feathers flying, of the domestic scene gravely disturbed, that presents women's primary experience of this November pogrom. The marauders destroyed property and beat and arrested men. With brutal exceptions, which are worth noting since they may indicate more violence against women than historians have recognized to date, and I have many, many examples of women being beaten up and shot. Most women were forced to stand by and watch their homes torn apart and their men abused. Later, they would anguish as the men disappeared into concentration camps and then try heroically to have them released, for the most part by struggling to get emigration papers. As women cleaned up the wreckage in the days following the pogrom, their most crucial task was to rescue their men. Wives of prisoners were told that their husbands would only be released if they could present emigration papers. Although there are no statistics to indicate their success, these women displayed extraordinary nerve and tenacity in saving a large number of men and in facilitating a mass exodus of married couples in 1939. Women summoned the courage to overcome gender stereotypes of passivity in order to find any means to have husbands and fathers released from camps. Fearfully, Charlotte Stein-Pick entered Nazi headquarters in Munich, the notorious Brown House, to request her husband's release based on his status as a World War I veteran. There she was shown her husband, 20 pounds thinner, and begged repeatedly for his release. The Nazis required that she explain the bookkeeping system of her husband's student fraternity, of which he was still treasurer. She could do this, and upon his release, she returned to the Brown House every month to keep the records of the organization until she left Germany. Ruth Abraham, the blonde woman I mentioned earlier, impressed not only her family, but the SS with her determination and bravery. During the November pogrom, it was she who pulled her fiancé out of hiding and led him through the teeming crowds. She then traveled to the concentration camp at Dachau to ask for the release of her future father-in-law. Arriving at the concentration camp in a bus filled with SS men, she was deposited inside the camp where she was ignored. She assumed that because of her blonde, Aryan looks, she was taken for a member of the League of German Girls. Finally, she requested an interview with the commander. She begged for the release of her elderly father-in-law and achieved success within 3 days with the intercession of a Nazi Party member. Again, she attributed her success to her looks, since the men she met refused to believe that she was a Jew and seemed to take pity on her. More common than physically arriving at a camp or at the Brown House was the dizzying procedure of obtaining proof of immediate emigration plans in order to obtain a relative's release from a concentration camp. On their own, women had to organize the papers, decide on the destination, sell their property, and organize the departure. Although the details of the red tape involved in these procedures goes beyond the scope of this talk, one example will illuminate the ordeal facing many women. Molly Dieneman, whose 63-year-old husband was deteriorating rapidly in Buchenwald, raced immediately to the Gestapo to prove they were ready for emigration. Next, she traveled to the passport office to get their passports back. The official there, who knew her, spitefully demanded proof of her husband's doctorate, so she had to run home to find it amidst the rubble because her house had been destroyed. Next, she went to the emigration office in a nearby city, to the Gestapo, the police, the tax office. Then she gave the required documents to the concentration camp office, as well as to the regional Gestapo in a different town. And still, it took weeks before her husband was let out. After that, she had to start running to numerous offices for emigration papers. Finally arriving in Palestine in March 1939, Rabbi Dieneman died from his ordeal 3 weeks later. Many women saw not only to their husband's release and the necessary papers, but also to selling their joint property. Accompanying her husband home after his release, one wife explained that she had just sold their house and bought tickets to Shanghai for the whole family. And the husband said at that point anything was okay with him. Expressions of thankfulness, tinged perhaps with a bit of surprise at women's heroism, can be found in many men's memoirs. Men were particularly indebted to women even after their ordeal in the camps, when men came home too beaten in body and spirit to be of much use in the scramble to emigrate. After the pogrom, those Jews who remained tried desperately to get out, and you probably all know this, anywhere, Latin America, Haiti, Cuba, Australia, Shanghai. But as is well known, profound obstacles to emigration existed. Despite all obstacles, Jewish emigration was far from negligible. Thus, by 1939, about 185,000 racially defined Jews still remained in Germany, and this figure sank to 164,000 Jews by October 41. Ultimately, about half of those Jews who had lived in Germany in 1933 could save themselves. When Jews packed, they believed that their departure would be permanent. Without exception, women took charge of the packing. This was so clearly considered women's work that some women stayed behind and sent husbands ahead so that they could do the packing. Packing was not only a necessity, it quickly became an art as Nazi rulings and red tape made the process into a nightmare. In order to emigrate with one's belongings, the finance department had to issue a permit, and this was only obtainable after lists of all the items Jews wished to take had been handed in. One woman spent an entire week writing, quote, endless lists in 5 copies each, and this is before computers. Every item entered, every list neatly typed. And in the end, I could only speak and breathe and think in shoes, towels, scissors, soap, and scarves. Also, one could not take just anything, especially things purchased after 1933, and some items could be taken only in limited amounts. After completing the lists, and often with ship or plane tickets in hand, Jews still had to await the authorization of the finance department. And Molly Dieneman wrote, whereas the Gestapo was in a rush to get us out, the finance office took its time. And without its certification, and that of the tax authorities, you didn't receive the so-called certificate of harmlessness. And without that, you didn't get your passport. And without that, no customs official could examine your bags. Thus, despite official policy encouraging emigration, the Nazi bureaucracy actually dawdled and delayed Jewish emigration. Again, connections and bribes seemed to speed up the process. And again, women without much previous experience in the world of officialdom had to seek such connections and master the art of bribing. Often, with the arduous packing completed and papers in hand, Jewish families send their lifts, today they are called containers, to interim stations, often ports in Holland. There they were stored until the owners knew their own and their furniture's final destinations. Sometimes they send their furniture out before they send themselves out. Some families, in fact, lost their possessions as their lifts were caught in the German invasion of Holland. Of course, few people could pack all their belongings. The giant lifts and the surcharge that the Nazis demanded for every item cost too much. Those who could afford even one lift had to sell most of their belongings, and most could not even afford that. For many, and I quote, packing reduced a lifetime of possessions into 3 suitcases. Thus, many emigrants, wealthy as well as poorer, tried to sell their homes and furniture for a pittance, mourning the loss of the haven they had created for themselves. The purchasers were Aryans, many complaining of their plight. A pastor's wife proclaimed, "We are suffering as much as you are," to which Alice Beerwald retorted, "Only with the difference that you're buying and I'm selling." Being women's work, packing gave some women the opportunity to save precious items from the clutches of the Nazis. Clearly, what they managed to smuggle out was paltry in comparison with what the Germans stole from them. Still, it helped their families subsist for a short time when they arrived abroad, penniless, and it saved a few precious mementos. Some women bribed the officials who came to their homes to inspect everything that went into the lifts or trunks or suitcases. Women often did this without consulting their husbands, knowing full well that their plans would have been vetoed. Other women engaged in even more dangerous schemes, smuggling jewelry or money abroad. Alice Beerwald concluded, quote, "So slowly we were taught how to become criminals, to attempt to circumvent every law." And it should be noted that women's involvement in this kind of illegality, which is actually, I don't think of it as real illegality, was not limited to personal subsistence or helping family, but could also help the community at large. Beate Berger, for example, smuggled money from Berlin to Palestine in order to buy land for a children's home. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about who stayed behind. Fewer women than men left Germany. Why was this so? There were still compelling reasons to stay, although life became increasingly difficult. And remember, I said that women were the ones to push for emigration, so it's interesting that ultimately women are the ones left behind. There's a contradiction there, which I'm going to try to explain. First, women could still find jobs in the Jewish social service sector more easily than men. Dr. Martha Wertheimer, for example, worked as a journalist prior to 1933. Thereafter, she plunged into Jewish welfare work, contributing to the Jewish press and tutoring English to earn a little extra money. She escorted many children's transports to England, worked 12-hour days without pausing for meals in order to advise Jews on emigration and welfare procedures, and organized continuing education courses for Jewish youth between the ages of 15 and 18 who had been drafted into forced labor. Ultimately, she wrote to a friend in New York that despite efforts to emigrate, she no longer awaited to escape. And I quote, "It is also worthwhile to be an officer on the sinking ship of Jewish life in Germany, to hold out courageously and to fill the lifeboats, to the extent that we have some." While the employment situation of Jewish women helped keep them in Germany, that of men helped get them out. As men lost their positions in businesses, some with business connections abroad were able to flee immediately, and others emigrated alone in order to establish themselves and then send for their families. Women's organizations agreed that wives should not hinder husbands from emigrating alone if there was no alternative. Another compelling reason why more women remained behind was the fact that before the war, men faced more immediate physical danger than women and were forced to flee promptly. In a strange twist of fortune, the men interred in concentration camps during the November pogrom were released only upon showing proof of their ability to depart from Germany immediately. Families, and here I mean mostly wives and mothers, strained every resource to provide the documentation to free these men and send them on their way. Even as women feared for their men, they believed that they would be spared serious harm by the Nazis. In retrospect, the author Ruth Kluger reflected on this kind of thinking and the resulting preponderance of women caught in the trap. And I quote, "One seemed to ignore the most obvious, namely just how endangered the weaker and more disadvantaged are. That the Nazis would stop at women contradicted their racist ideology. Had one relied on their chivalry via some absurd patriarchal short circuit? Further, as more and more sons left, daughters remained as the sole caretakers for their elderly parents. One female commentator noted a whole slew of women who, quote, can't think of emigration because they don't know who might care for their elderly mother in the interim, before they could start sending her money. In the same families, the sons went their way." end quote. In fact, leaving one's aging parent, again as statistics indicate, usually the mother, was the most painful act imaginable. As early as 1936, the League of Jewish Women saw cause for serious concern regarding the more general problem of the emigration of women, quote, which is often overlooked and not understood. The League of Jewish Women also turned toward parents, reminding them of, quote, their responsibility to free their daughters too, even if daughters feel stronger psychological ties to their families than sons. In 36-37, 54% of Jewish immigrants to the United States were men and only 46% were women. Even as late as January 1938, the Hilfsverein, one of the main emigration organizations, announced that, quote, up to now, Jewish emigration indicates a severe surplus of men. Blaming this on the nature of women to feel closer to family and home and on that of men toward greater adventurousness, the Hilfsverein echoed the League of Jewish Women in warning that Jewish women would no longer find marriage partners in Germany and that Jewish men would either intermarry abroad or marry Jews of a different culture, making the marriage more precarious. The Hilfsverein suggested that couples marry before emigrating, encouraged women to prepare themselves as household helpers, and promised that women's emigration would become a priority. Yet only 2 months later, the Hilfsverein announced that it would only expedite the emigration of those young women who could prove a minimum competence in household skills and were willing to work as domestics abroad. Fewer women than men seem to have received support from Jewish organizations in order to emigrate. Moreover, young women and their families were often reluctant to consider Palestine and the kibbutz as an alternative for daughters. Total immigration statistics for Palestine, compiled by the Jewish Agency, indicate that between 1933 and 1942, about 27,000 males and 24,000 females entered from Germany. Of these, the gender proportions of children and married people were about the same. This discrepancy can be seen among the 8,000 bachelors and the 5,000 single females. The growing disproportion of Jewish women in the German Jewish population also resulted from the fact that, to begin with, there were more Jewish women than men in Germany. Thus, in order to stay even, a greater absolute number of women would have had to emigrate. In 1933, about 52% of Jews were women, resulting from such factors as male casualties in World War I, greater exogamy among Jewish men, and greater longevity among women. The slow rate of female emigration meant that the female proportion of the Jewish population rose to almost 58% by 1939. Looking around in 1939, one woman wrote, and I quote, "Mostly we were women who had been left to ourselves. In part, our husbands had died from shock, partly they had been processed from life to death in a concentration camp, and partly some wives, who, aware of the greater danger to their husbands, had prevailed upon them to leave at once and alone. They were ready to take care of everything and to follow their husbands later on. But because of the war, it became impossible for many to realize this intention, and quite a few of my friends and acquaintances thus became martyrs of Hitler." Women, but elderly women in particular, remained behind in disproportionate numbers. In 1933, the ratio of elderly Jewish women to men had already been 1,400 women to 1,000 men over the age of 65. And since many of the young had emigrated by 1935, the number of elderly Jews also increased proportionately, among them a large, large number of widows. By 1937-38, recipients of the Jewish Winter Relief included a large proportion of elderly women, as well as, in total, a large number of female recipients of relief. When Elizabeth Freund went to the Gestapo for her emigration papers in 1941, she observed, quote, "all old people, old women, waiting on line." Freund's was the last train out of Germany. The women she described were trapped. In short, in slightly less than 8 years, 2/3 of German Jews emigrated, leaving a disproportionate number of the elderly and of women. In conclusion, Mary Felsteiner, in her new book, To Paint Her Life, Charlotte Solomon in the Nazi Era, which is a wonderful book, and I would recommend it to anyone, Mary Felsteiner has written that, quote, "along the stations toward extinction, each gender lived its own journey." She's essentially correct. The Nazis attacked Jewish men and women primarily as Jews, and all Jews shared this agony. Yet Jews were affected by and reacted to the Nazi onslaught in gendered ways. Focusing on the home, women saw their role as keeping the family together, maintaining a sense of normalcy in the midst of desperation, while learning to live with less and to expect even worse, and protecting their husbands and children when danger confronted them by mediating between them and the regime. As a result of gendered socialization, they reacted to the Nazi threat earlier, pressing their men to emigrate. And as a result of gender discrimination, when the time to escape came, women in large numbers were left behind. In referring to the artist, Charlotte Solomon, on the ramp at Auschwitz, across from her husband, lined up with the men, Felstiner concluded, "The two incommensurate lines on the ramp stretched back decades, centuries." Thank you.